More than 20 dangerous substances are due to be recategorised under new legislation aimed at tackling the growing use of highly addictive synthetic opioids.
Among them is the powerful sedative xylazine, which is most commonly used by vets for the treatment of livestock and horses. So the tranquilizer, sometimes mixed with heroin and fentanyl, is also known as a zombie drug due to its effects on users. If injected directly into the bloodstream, it can cause large open skin ulcers to form. These ulcers can go on to become infected, causing rot, and in severe cases even lead to the amputation of limbs. The drug has been blamed for a rising number of deaths across parts of the US, and now the government here is banning its use outside of the veterinary industry with a new C classification and a prison sentence of up to 14 years for anyone caught producing or supplying it.
Let's talk to Dr. Caroline Copeland, who's the director of the National Programme on Substance Use Mortality. Good morning to you, Dr. Copeland. This drug, could you explain a little bit more about the physical impact it has on those who take it?
So this drug, xylazine, can have effects, both immediate sedative effects, which can cause respiratory depression and death, particularly when used with other opioids, other strong opioids like fentanyl, which is what we're seeing in the US. And it essentially works by stopping the chemicals in the brain from being released and your brain cells talking to each other, and causes sedation that way. And then the skin sores are the more long-term effect that it can have. And that's because this drug can close blood vessels. And if you haven't got blood flowing to your tissues, you haven't got oxygen delivery, you haven't got delivery of nutrients, and that tissue starts to die. And that's what we're seeing with the skin sores. And because if tissue doesn't have supply of blood, it's not going to live for very long. And it's these skin sores which, if they become infected, can lead to limbs being needed to be amputated. And this is a very long-term effect, obviously, if you've lost a limb. And so if somebody has recovered from drug use and is integrating back into the community, they might still have this very long-term health harm, which will be debilitating for them in the future.
You took a look, you reported on the first death, the only death that's been recorded in the UK and attributed to xylazine. What did you find, and what did it prompt you to ask more questions about?
So it was obviously very disappointing and concerning that when we first saw that death happened in May 2021. But because of the time it takes for coroners to perform their thorough investigations and for these deaths to then be reported formally, it took until last year for that death to be reported. And a year later, we now have over 30 deaths that have been reported to the programme. So it might be that deaths were happening before that particular case, but the drug just wasn't being looked for. So, but now we are looking for it. We're seeing it appearing in many more cases.
So in terms of it not being looked for, how do you find it? How do police find it?
So this is when you're screening for a drug in a toxicology screen, we have what's called a standard library of drugs which are looked for. And xylazine wasn't in that standard library for a very long time. And so if you're looking at the types of drugs that someone might have taken and you see things like heroin and fentanyl, you'll think, oh, well, those drugs were probably enough to cause death. I'm not going to carry on looking for more. A bit like if you found your keys in the morning and you need to leave, you're not going to keep on looking for the spare set. You've got the cause of the problem. So it wasn't being looked for, but as soon as it was being looked for, that's when it was being seen.
I suppose one thing is when it's being mixed with other drugs. So a drug that someone intends to take but doesn't know that this xylazine, for example, is in it. I mean, how can that be prevented?
But that's very difficult to prevent, and we have very little evidence that there's an active user market for xylazine in the UK. So people aren't going to their street dealers and actually requesting for drugs which include xylazine. They're thinking that they're buying heroin or street diazepam, which is Valium, and what they're actually getting is this xylazine. And that's incredibly dangerous, because if people don't know what drug it is that they're getting, they don't know what a safe dose might be, and they might accidentally overdose as a result. In terms of being able to try and see if that's what they've got, there is one drug testing facility in the UK recently opened in Bristol, where people can go in and take their drug supplies for testing and be told what their drugs actually contain. But so there's only one of those sites. It's not particularly convenient for everyone to go there. And there are things called xylazine test strips, a bit like the COVID test. You drop a bit of the drug sample onto them and you can see if your drug sample does or doesn't contain xylazine. But you need to be cautious about those tests, because they're only testing for xylazine. And if you get a negative result saying no xylazine, it doesn't mean that there isn't something else that's equally or more nasty, such as some of the synthetic opioid nitazines, which were also controlled in this legislation.
Dr. Caroline Copeland, Senior Lecturer in Pharmacology and Toxicology at King's College London, thank you very much for your time with us here on BBC Breakfast.
Thank you.